Welcome to this edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. It is the afternoon of Friday, the 18th of November, 2016. We are now confronted with a grim scene, which is represented, first of all, by the initial appointments. Now, these are the permanent appointments, no longer the transition team, so-called, but the actual administration. However, before we look at those, we've also got to remember that this is our Thanksgiving program, and this great American holiday always compels our admiration. So we want to have a few things to say about the origin of the holiday and what it might mean for us today. But now let's look, before we get into our somewhat more festive and celebratory holiday mood, let's talk about these appointments. I think we told you yesterday, with the help of the Washington Post, that what appeared to be occurring was a veering sharply to the right and a straying from the economic populist message that was championed by the Republican candidate in the primaries and then in the presidential campaign. So, who do we have so far? Well, for those of you who are keeping score, the most recent, in some ways the most, I guess, bizarre, is Congressman Mike Pompeo of Kansas. And Mike Pompeo of Kansas is from Kansas. He, of course, did go to school at West Point, right? He was a military officer. He went to Harvard Law School, but his entire outlook would seem to be that, let's say, promoted by the Koch brothers, the Koch brothers, right? Remember, when you say Kansas, anything about Kansas, from Pompeo to Kobach, also in the running for various offices as right-wing ideologues, you got to remember that these people are in the Koch or Koch brothers orbit. So Mike Pompeo certainly fills the bill on that. He's from Kansas. He was a congressman. He wanted to be more than a congressman. And interestingly enough, in this election, according to CNN and other sources, Pompeo actually did not back Trump in the primary. And normally this is enough to get you excluded, or even a lack of zeal in the support of Trump is also enough to get you excluded. But Pompeo, no, he was able to back Senator Rubio in the election campaign, the primary, and then criticized Trump, in the view of CNN, criticized Trump from the right. But then he rallied to the Trump election campaign and was sometimes in touch with the candidate. Now, again, this doesn't look like a strong relation that would merit, such a critical post as the CIA. And that is why I think we might be seeing the influence of these Kansas-based billionaires in the choice. That, I think, is certainly plausible. But I'm simply speculating. Pompeo met with Trump some days ago, and he is the first member of the House of Representatives to be chosen by Trump. There are other people still on the list, right? Hen Sarling is still in contention, as far as we know, to be Secretary of the Treasury. And we have a couple of others there in the House. The big reputation builder for Pompeo, and the way that he is known, is that after 2012, we had a series of investigations. It was an interminable procession of probes in the House of Representatives, which focused on the Benghazi events, the tragic death of 4 American representatives in Benghazi, Libya, on September 11th of 2012. Now, I've stated repeatedly what I see in this. This was an October surprise. This was an attempt to manipulate the election of 2012. It was a desire to get Obama out and Romney in. And I think now that you see what happened in this election, right, with the Comey FBI interference in this entire thing, I think my argument has now become more plausible in the light of subsequent historical events. I think that's the case, right? You can see that intelligence agencies think nothing and actually cultivate their ability to meddle with elections. So as it was in 2012, in that case it didn't work. This time around with Comey and the New York FBI field office Breitbart faction, well, that looks like it's actually happening. It has happened, and it has worked. So where does Pompeo come in? There was this committee, and people remember the chairman of the committee, right? The Republican senator from South Carolina, Trey Gowdy. And you remember the big thing with him was his changing hairdos. And what he eventually, I think, ended up with, at least for a while, was a slick-backed hairdo parted down the middle, kind of like one of those figures in the R Gang comedies. And Trey Gowdy was considered a firebrand, but he was only a firebrand until he met Mike Pompeo. Pompeo considered that Trey Gowdy was a softy, that he was not aggressive enough, that he was not draconian enough. So according to CNN, Pompeo staked a tougher line on Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton than some other Republicans. Pompeo was one of a handful of conservatives, again, conservative in quotes in my book, this is nothing conservative about this, who argued House Benghazi Committee Chairman Trey Gowdy did not go far enough in his report on Clinton earlier in the year. So this year. So that's Pompeo. Another interesting thing about Pompeo is that he was controversial even in the world of Kansas politics. And this is really saying something. Here we go with a CNN account. Pompeo had considered running against Kansas Senator Jerry Moran in the Senate Republican primary this year, but the Senate Republicans scrambled to prevent that. This was one of these cases where the Tea Party guy, because that's what he is, he's a Tea Party man, Pompeo, they thought was too far right and would lose or embarrass them or whatever it was. So what happened was the National Republican Senatorial Committee hired a retired FBI agent to dig up dirt against Pompeo, according to CNN. And numerous senators, and Senator Paul Ryan, urged Pompeo to stay out of the senatorial primary. Pompeo ultimately released a scathing statement when he decided not to run. So you see, Pompeo is also on record saying the American Muslim community does not condemn terrorist attacks enough and can be considered potentially complicit in those attacks. So that's at least a beginning on Pompeo. Now, Pompeo has to go through Senate confirmation. And in his case, this may not be as easy as it sounds because the Republican votes are there on paper, but notice the bad blood between Moran and Pompeo. Let's see if those rivalries are extinguished or if they live on. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. We're just running down the latest appointments now, and these are some of the most important ones. The CIA job, obviously, is extremely sensitive and extremely important. The people on NPR this morning, the various journalists in the domestic and international hours, frankly knew nothing of Pompeo, right? Because a lot of people have not paid much attention to these Benghazi hearings because they're repetitive and were essentially a sounding board, right? A soapbox for people to use to pontificate about various subjects. So the response was considered to be, who is that? Shock, surprise, it's scorched earth. Some note that Pompeo has cooperated with Senator Cotton of Arkansas to try to undermine the Iran nuclear accord. One of the things that's emerging now, let me just stress this now, there are some people in this administration now, like General Flynn, get to him in a minute. General Flynn purports to be a friend of Russia. I'm not so sure. In other words, I don't know how deep that commitment goes. But what we see for sure is the anti-Iran animus is very big. And this goes for the candidates. And now we've got somebody like Pompeo. I think we can classify him as one of the main adversaries of Iran. And I'm afraid that extends to, reasonable forms of peaceful coexistence, right? He doesn't seem to want that. And he's talked about the question of the Iranian nuclear accord. Notice that it is impossible now to revive the Iran nuclear accord if the United States should choose to leave it, because nobody in this world, nobody but nobody, will reimpose economic sanctions on Iran if the United States decides that this is not working. You got to make it work, because you will not get Europe, you will not get Japan, certainly not Russia, China, and any of these other actors, right? They can sell the Iranians everything they need, and the U.S. will simply succeed in robbing Boeing of 120 plane orders. That will be the only consequence. They'll go to Airbus and they'll make out just fine. So the anti-Iranian one, and I'm getting different indications from Europe. We have a bunch of confused Europeans, partly dragged into the wake of the Russian media establishment. I don't know, the government of Russia may be one thing, but for sure, the Russian media establishment has gone way out on a limb for the current Republican or the coming Republican administration. Ironically, they have to sprinkle here and there these ideas like, don't choose Bolton because he's for war, right? Don't pick Bolton. Well, if the Republican administration is so good, why do you keep having to issue these warnings that we're on the brink of a Secretary of State who might be absolutely unacceptable, or a national security guy? At least I think they probably think they're covered on that. The CIA guy, I don't know what he says about Russia. I can't think it's anything good. But when you get to the Iranian side of it, we've got some pretty energetic Iranophobes, put it that way. And you can start a world war that way too, right? In other words, you think you're gonna mess around with Iran. You think you're gonna start shooting if they make a gesture that you don't like. No, I'm sorry. That in today's world is no longer possible. You can't have this cowboy stuff. So I would urge such people to carefully reconsider. I think they've been sold a bill of goods. I can see that some of the arguments are the ones advanced by various Russian sources, and I think a lot of those are spurious. And you've also got to look at the internal policy. I have said during the Monday to Thursday program, the American System, the Russian ability to analyze politics in the West, I think, has shown itself to be faulty. Faulty during the French Popular Front, faulty during the Spanish Civil War, faulty during the pre-1933 period in Germany. If you look at what the Moscow-oriented KPD was doing in Germany before the coming of National Socialism, you will find that they were making grievous errors. And this program is committed to a Russian-U.S. condominium in international affairs, especially as regards questions like ending the Syrian war before things get worse. But that, of course, does not exclude an honest disagreement and honest criticism and constructive criticism about what's going on with the U.S. internal policies. And again, look at that Russian track record. I'm thinking of, you can also think of the leaders that they put in charge of the Communist Party USA. CPUSA leaders could hardly have been worse the entire time, almost without exception. So we'll be talking about that and when the snow flies in the hot stove season. So the other question with Pompeo, the CIA is notoriously a land of entrenched bureaucrats. Will those entrenched bureaucrats resist? Because they're the CIA, right? They're guys with all kinds of capabilities. What are they going to do? Are they going to pull out some dossiers, things like this? We just don't know. So what we're left with is Pompeo. Now we've also got the Attorney General is Senator Sessions of Alabama. And he's a Trump loyalist, right? We've been watching him during the campaign. I guess what we principally have to know about him, he wanted to be a federal judge in 1986, and he was rejected by the Senate in that year, and he was bitterly disappointed. The main cause seems to be that he was portrayed as a racist, and that he was nostalgic, let's say, for the previous situation, right? The pre-1950s situation in the South. That is an ominous appointment, I guess I have to say. And the other thing, though, is that on these two, on Pompeo and on Sessions, they have to go through Senate confirmation. Pompeo is likely to be the choice to oppose. If the Democrats are going to oppose anybody, it's probably Pompeo, because there is this history of bad blood with the senator from the same state, who normally should have been the sponsor. With Sessions, I guess Sessions has a pretty good chance to get through, because the Senate is notoriously partial to its own, right? And we'll be back in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. I am, of course, your canary in the coal mine. I am the guy where if I go down, the First Amendment, to a certain extent, goes down with me. So you've got to be attuned to this. At least I invite you to, and appeal to you to do it. And one way you can support the enterprise that I'm in is to support The American System. The American System airs Monday through Thursday. It's about an hour. With this, you can keep up with everything as it happens, day by day, practically hour by hour. Please go to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv, and buy a subscription. You can also buy an activist subscription. That's $20. That's the most. That's a tremendous help with every one of those. And now that we have the holiday season coming, think about getting some gift subscriptions to the American System for people who need to be enlightened. All right. We now have General Michael Flynn. He is a disgruntled former military man. He was the head, I guess, of the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. He quarreled with Obama and was ousted. He was cashiered as a general. He has been active on Twitter, I think not exactly to his own advantage. His son also active on Twitter. His son has retweeted any number of conspiracy theorists on various issues. These are often issues involving charges about Hillary Clinton and her nefarious activities. The conspiracies apparently involve globalism, that the globalists are here and they're going to do you in, and therefore you better realize, how nefarious they are and these terrible things that they do. Other scandals they're not so interested in, but the anti-Hillary ones. And, of course, one of the things that's going on in politics right now is that you don't have Hillary Clinton to kick around anymore. So a lot of, if you remember the final phase of the campaign, when you had these Republican surrogates on TV and they were confronted with, why the latest thing your candidate did was this, that, and the other thing. And they'd say, yeah, but that's nothing. Look at Hillary Clinton. Look what she just did. This particular defense falls to the ground. And if they try to keep it up, it really won't serve them well. All right, so the White House National Security Council Director General Flynn. Now, this is an important job. This coordinates the government. This is the White House Chief of Staff coordinates the White House. That's a huge job, right? That's Priebus of Wisconsin. But now we've also got to coordinate the government. I would say one recent example was the failure, the utter failure of Condoleezza Rice to coordinate the U.S. government during the summer of 2001, when various indications were coming in about something big that was about to happen, coming from different governments, coming from the spies, right, the human intelligence, HUMINT, and so forth. Condoleezza Rice failed completely to coordinate any of that, right? Connecting the dots. Who's supposed to connect the dots? The National Security Director. Will General Flynn be able to do it? His profile, from what you can see, is that he's irascible. Anger, seems to be his ruling passion. And will that work well in the White House? I don't know. But he's coming in, because that does not need a senatorial approval. So I would think probably Pompeo is the one to be focused on in terms of can he get through the Senate. We're also getting, Romney, the former Republican presidential candidate, Mitt Romney, has announced that he's going to be meeting with Trump over the weekend. Now, on the National Public Radio Domestic Hour, we have Major Garrett. Remember him, formerly of Fox, now of CBS. Garrett essentially argues that the coming of Romney is pure symbolism. Garrett is adamant that Romney is not being considered for anything, for nothing. It's simply an attempt to balance or ameliorate the impressions that have been given. I would say it's quite obvious that the Bannon nomination has elicited a wave of consternation and condemnation for all of the reasons that we know. We don't have to go through this. And that there was a desire to try to get Bannon off the front page and bring in somebody who's considered to be less less extreme. And that would be Romney. So again, Garrett says this is not going to lead to anything, right? Romney may think, he may delude himself that he's being actively considered for the Secretary of State, but it won't work. So we're also told that General Mattis has voiced his desire to come on board. People are still kicking around the name of Stephen Hadley, National Security Council Director in the second George W. Bush administration, second half of the Iraq War. That is certainly there. And for Secretary of State, we've got names like Giuliani. We've got names like Corker. We might have Nikki Haley, the governor of South Carolina. We have any number. Rand Paul, interestingly, condemns the possible nominations of Bolton and of Giuliani and recommends Senator Corker. And the idea there is that Giuliani and especially Bolton are bellicose, right? They're people who believe in military solutions, unilateral ones at that. So, no, says Rand Paul, let's have Corker. And he says that he may be able to get 2 or 3 Republican senators on board to rob Giuliani or Bolton of the majority. And then he also says that he's talked to 20 Republican senators who say that they'd be happy to vote for Democratic senators. Talked to Democratic senators, 20 of them, who say they would be happy to vote for Corker. And if you look at Corker in terms of what you see, this may turn out to be the lesser evil. And of course, I'm broadcasting to you from a fallen world where lesser evils, the lesser evils of today, would have been rather shocking yesterday. But this is the way it is. Harry Reid going out with a bang. Quite a fighter. Wish he'd fought more, at least gotten more media during the time he was there. Harry Reid stresses the ideological continuity of right now. He says, this is not, what you're seeing today is not new. These various positions that are being brought forward, those, he says, grow directly out of the Congress. And in particular, he says that the current president-elect owes his ideology to Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, and people like that, because that's what the congressional Republicans have been doing for a long time. Now, we have this interesting article in Politico, and it's about Wall Street influence. And this is, I think, where the tragedy of all of this comes to the fore. The current president-elect ran on a ticket of economic, populism, cultural populism. And he was trying to mobilize various economic grievances. He was not providing economic solutions to this, but he was providing cultural populist, talking about grievances. We got to take a look at this, because what Politico found is that we're approaching the greatest Wall Street influx into Washington since the 1920s. And we need to come back in a minute and treat this. So, Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C., urging you to keep up with the news day by day in these parlous times by going to AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv, and subscribing. Right? You can listen to it every day. And I urge you to do it. It's the best way to support me, or one of the best ways to support me. So, this whole thing was populism, right? Drain the swamp, attack the elites, turn them out, mortify the establishment, and so forth. Well, the establishment is not mortified. Here's what we find. The Politico article here by Ben White on the 17th of November, yesterday. Bankers celebrate dawn of Trump era. A populist candidate who rallied against shady investment interests is on the trail, is putting together an administration that looks like an investment banker's dream. What do we find? That the picture shows us Goldman Sachs banker Stephen Mnuchin, or Menuhin, Mnuchin. He has been seen at Trump Tower. The rumors are flying that he's the leading candidate for the Secretary of the Treasury. Billionaire investor Wilbur Ross may get the Commerce Department, right? Promotion of trade. That's a very political post. Steve Bannon, also of Goldman Sachs, will be the ideological advisor, steps away from the Oval Office. I think of him as the ideologue of this incoming government. J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon is a possibility for Treasury Secretary, and it's called a restoration of Wall Street power after, I wouldn't say that Wall Street had lost power after 2008, 2009, but whatever they've had, through Geithner and people like this, it's now going to be increased. We have a historian, Charles Geist, Wall Street historian at Manhattan College, and his comment is, quote, "You would have to go back to the 1920s to see so much Wall Street influence coming to Washington. It's the most dramatic turnaround one could imagine." That's the truly astonishing part. There is a move to get rid of the Dodd-Frank financial reform law. That would include getting rid of the Consumer Products Bureau that she had created, right, for the protection of individual investors. And we've also got these other interesting quotes. One executive from Goldman Sachs says there is a joke, quoting, "There is a joke going around here that if we'd have known how good Trump was going to be for Wall Street, they'd have campaigned for him," these bankers. People are reacting, again quoting, "What people are reacting to is the incredible cultural shift. People thought it might be 10 or 15 years until the regulatory onslaught, they would say, had stopped, but now it could happen overnight." Lloyd Blankfein, the head of Goldman Sachs, the CEO, says Trump's policies are market supportive. I'm not saying good or bad, but if it's just asset prices in the market that you're looking at, it's going to be supportive. So the other one is, here's an interesting quote. There's going to have to be, or there may be, doesn't have to be, but probably will be, some kind of changes as regards the Federal Reserve. It might be possible to force out Janet Yellen and Stanley Fischer. That's in a year. And according to Politico, that could be the biggest boon of all to Wall Street, who could replace them with candidates less inclined to maintain high capital requirements and otherwise be regulated, somewhat regulated, a little bit regulated. Now they're going to be deregulated, regulated, not at all. Quote from Dick Bove, banking analyst at Rafferty Capital Markets, quote, "If you really want to reduce bank regulation, you have to change the nature of the Fed so it really has the desire to start easing off." And I think he's talking about just the personnel, right? Maybe he's talking about something more. You have 2 board seats empty, and he can push out Yellen and Fisher, and that would give him 4 out of 7. And 5 if Daniel Tarullo, now on the board, decides that he's isolated and he wants to resign. For the Secretary of the Treasury, we said Jem Hensarling of Texas and other people, right? We've heard from Carl Icahn. We've heard from any number of others. So Elizabeth Warren's reforms, I think inadequate though they were, the Dodd-Frank reforms, certainly inadequate. But even those considered too onerous. So I have to talk to those working people. I have to ask you, what the question everybody's asking is, when will this reality begin to register? In other words, to some people, this is already a sign of what's coming, of course, because, as I've tried to stress, we have to look at these appointments, right, the merry-go-round of names and rumors, not because we're interested in gossip, but because these individuals are harbingers of policy. In other words, if you pick Bolton for Secretary of State, then that is a bellicose and aggressive kind of policy, right? Totally against the United Nations. If you have some of these others, why? You might have a desire to attack the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's possible. If you're going to get rid of Dodd-Frank, why stop there? Why not roll back the New Deal legislation? I guess it's the Glass-Steagall law and other legislation that that provided the regulatory framework that we now have. So that, I think, is something important. And it's not just the fact of it, but it is the perception, right? Unfortunately, the modern media mantra is that perception is reality. Right? That's, if you're philosophically inclined, that's Bishop Berkeley back in the early 1700s saying, esse est percepi. To be, to exist, is to be perceived. That's all there is to it. It's all perception. Well, unfortunately, it's more than perception. There is reality. We've said this again and again. There is military, economic, there's even political, if you look at it in the proper way. So, who might offer an alternative to this? In other words, a dissenting voice. One of the problems in the ability of working people to understand what's happening, in other words, to recognize these developments for what they are, is that notoriously people need organizations to be able to respond. If you don't have a trade union and you're a working person and you come home tired and you don't have a chance to do all this intelligence work, you're going to be left there. It's going to be you and the television. That's bad enough. Or in today's world, it's going to be you and the computer. It's going to be you and the internet. And if it's the alternate internet, right, if it's these crazy sites that deny reality, deny facts, they're militantly against facts, then such people are going to remain, in many ways, an inert mass. They're not going to be able to assimilate an overview of what's actually happening. So the moment of, what can we say, realization, the moment of understanding what's actually happening, that may take quite a while. So people had better hunker down, right? Because it's going to be a while. Now, in terms of something more positive, let's just talk about some of the economic possibilities, right? Because even, for example, we just had Senator Van Hollen, Senator-elect Van Hollen from Maryland here on the local radio. And what does he have to say? Well, talked about infrastructure. Why don't we talk about infrastructure too? Because that's the one hopeful thing on the horizon. If you can get some of that, it's all to the good, provided the right people pay for it. Back in a minute. Welcome to the second hour of A World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. on the afternoon of November 18th, 2016. Now, as we've stressed, the one positive aspect of the incoming administration in domestic affairs may well be this question of infrastructure. Now, the current proposal is for $1 trillion spent over 10 years, compared to the terrible decline in the national infrastructure. That is a very low figure. That will not be enough. And you also have to then factor in, if this is going to be financed as a public-private partnership, it means that the private investors will demand an income flow coming out of this entire project. So they will be a net subtraction. I don't see why we need them. What the usual argument in favor of infrastructure is that government bureaucrats don't know how to organize things, and therefore they waste money and they don't do a good job in that sense. Well, I don't see any argument in this case that people don't know how to build highways, right? We've had a highway bill. I think we had a highway bill of a couple of $100 billion a few years ago. I think it might have gotten up to $250 or $300 billion, again, over multiple years. So what is it that the privatization part is supposed to bring? We have some people out there arguing, saying, just print the money, have deficit spending. Well, that's perhaps better than a public-private partnership, although it's problematic in other ways. The obvious thing to do is to force the Federal Reserve to cough up several $trillion, my proposal, $5 trillion in 100-year financing. In other words, buy bonds from the states and the local governments that say, State of Illinois, infrastructure bond, maturity 100 years, coupon 0, no interest. And you sell that to the Federal Reserve, they buy it, and that can be paid off then at 1% a year over the next century, right? That shouldn't be too hard. Tolling, putting tolls on these things. There is a woman in these think tanks here in Washington. I think her name is Furchtgott Roth, I'm pretty sure. And she is the great exponent of slapping toll gates on everything. And of course, that is what when you go down the Rhine in Germany, right? You see that there were these castles at every point. Well, every one of those castles was a toll gate. And this was one of the things that made commerce, development, progress so difficult in the Middle Ages, was that everybody was collecting tolls. So let's evaluate the U.S. tradition here, I think we've recited this before, but many history books repeat the summing up of the Public Works Administration. That would be Harry Hopkins. It's the other way around. Works Progress Administration and Public Works Administration. Public Works is Harold Ickes, and Works Progress Administration is Harry Hopkins. So, again, using primarily public money, they solicited proposals from states and cities, same thing I'm saying, hired millions of workers, and eventually built 78,000 bridges, 650,000 miles of roads, 700 miles of airport runways, 13,000 playgrounds, 125,000 military and civilian buildings, including more than 40,000 schools. You go into these places in the Farm Belt or the poorer parts of the Midwest, the main buildings are all WPA, the library, the school, the city hall, the post office. You get the idea. So what might be the projects, right? We have the American Society of Civil Engineers. They're giving us a C- or a D. That's no good. So this has to be a big deal. If we get popular enthusiasm for infrastructure, and this is a warning to leftists, right? You can't make your program depend on not building pipelines here, not building pipelines there, and not doing other things because of the snail darters, right? Those blue-collar guys are not so interested as you are in the snail darters. This will not work. You have to be realistic. And I'll show you how the environmental concerns can be made to fit in to this stuff, because they absolutely can in any number of ways, right? But the idea is that infrastructure is where we meet. There are, of course, also obscurantist movements in Europe, right? The Grillo movement in Italy. Oh, they don't like the fast train going up one of the valleys in Piedmont towards France. This is an absolute blind alley. This is the collapse of civilization is what you find when you go down that road. So let's go through a couple. The Hudson River Rail Tunnel, about $24 billion. So the Northeast Corridor needs another way to get across the Hudson River. I would add the famous tunnel in Baltimore, where the whole East Coast system depends on a tunnel which has been built 110 years ago, approximately, and where you can't get the double-stacked containers through without reinvesting in that. So add that in. California High-Speed Rail, $65 billion. Jerry Brown has begun this. It's going up the Central Valley, but it's got to connect San Francisco and Los Angeles, 400 miles, 3 hours. I'm citing from the New York Times article of a couple of days ago. An international bridge across the Detroit River, right? We got some bridges across there. Need another one. Gordie Howe International Bridge, Detroit to Windsor, Ontario. Right now there's a privately owned bridge with 3 million vehicles. That's one of the busiest bridges. Here, Project Clean Lake. Now, for you environmentalists, right, there is a lot in here that will be of interest. Cleaning up Lake Erie. It is full of pollution. One problem is that the rains flush the sewage out of the sewers of Cleveland, and that's got to be fixed. And what's that going to cost you? About $3 billion. But for that, you get clean water. Isn't that worth it? Isn't that the way to do it? Let's see. For this, you need to do about 7 new tunnels for sewage and water. So imagine being able to swim in Lake Erie. That'll be the day. The Northeast Corridor maglev. Now, this is absolutely critical. This would go from maybe Washington, D.C. to Boston. It might go from, I would say, have it go from Norfolk, Virginia, up into Maine, but 300 miles an hour. Now, this is no longer steel wheel on steel rail. This is a magnetic cushion, magnetic levitation railroad, right? Maglev, that's where it comes from. So you could go from New York to Washington in an hour, and the valiant attempt to make the Acela fill the role of a fast rail, that would then be overcome. The Miami seawall, $20 billion. Now here we go. if the level of the ocean is rising, doesn't it make sense to put the resources in defending directly and on the scene the assets which are threatened? You're going to try to tell me that you're going to affect a world atmosphere in which the smokestacks of China, India, and a dozen other places are belching smoke into the atmosphere? You can't do that. You're going to have to deal with the symptoms that you see. And I think that's again, our motto here. The answer to inundation is elevation, or in this case, it's called a system of levees, a system of seawalls, storm surge protectors. And this imitates the Maastlankering, of Rotterdam, Holland. And that's also for New York City, right, to protect New York City from the storm surge. So giant sea doors that open and close automatically to protect the harbor, attractive and effective. Boston, Charleston, Galveston, Savannah, and New Orleans also candidates, and New York. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, our Thanksgiving edition. We're trying to accentuate the positive with an overview of some very obvious, long overdue infrastructure projects. We just did the Miami seawall for $20 billion. Denver I-70 East, $1.17 billion. Put a part of the road underground. Have another big dig. Boston had a big dig. The Republicans are still screaming. With that, you can have nice parks, bike paths, walks, farmers markets. I'm talking to the environmentalists. Look at how positive this can be for your concerns. Right? Fix up Lake Erie. Deal with the consequences of the rising oceans. Right? It doesn't depend on any theory. It's a way to protect Miami from the water, quite apart from any theory, one way or the other. The Maryland Purple Line, $5.6 billion. So the idea with this is, if you look at, for example, the Moscow subway system, there's a circle line that goes all around the outside. It's like an oval. It looks sort of like an egg. In the case of the D.C. system, of course, we've only got two. It's a two-track system, one line in each direction, inadequate. But we've also got the problem that there is no circle line. So this is an attempt to begin building a circle line. Maryland wants to build 16 miles of light rail. This would essentially be, trolley cars, modern. And it would go from the Bethesda area, I guess. Bethesda area would follow an oval configuration over towards I-95 and above all the Amtrak lines, right, at New Carrollton. So it would therefore get the subway system in connection with Amtrak and with the metro, of course, and with the metro of the red line north of Silver Spring. So what's the advantage here, right, for the environmentalists? You want to get cars off the road. We've talked about this. You need fast rail. You need urban mass transit. It's run by electricity. We'll figure out later where the electricity comes from, but it's not going to be oil and it's not going to be coal. And this would take 17,000 cars off the roads each day. So look at the environmental payoff, if you will, if you can't appreciate what it will mean to the commuters around here. South Carolina dams, $685 million. The problems with 600 dams in South Carolina, they are rated either high danger or significant hazard by the Army Corps of Engineers. So why not modernize the entire system of dams and water control? Let me add, there's something called the Ohio River, the Tennessee River, the Cumberland River. There are the locks at the entrance into Lake Superior. All of this stuff has to be rebuilt. How about this one? The Texas Bullet Train, $10 billion. This is a Japanese-style bullet train and high-speed rail, of course, so it's steel wheel on steel rail, but still, that's fine. There's something called the Texaplex. There's another one called the Texas T-Bone. One is Dallas-Fort Worth. Dallas-Fort Worth to Houston is 240 miles in 90 minutes. San Antonio, Austin could also be added in, and with that you've covered 75% of the state's population. Public works projects, as one expert here says, will address the public anger that elected Trump, and it is the fact that regular folks are not being taken care of. It's nice to have hotels and parks, but it's got to be public works for everybody. The great problem with the Obama stimulus is not that it had no public works spending. It's that so much of the stimulus was wasted on these silly tax cuts for the wrong people advanced by the Republicans, which they made the price of their cooperation, and then they voted against it. They got that junk in there, and then they voted against it. There were about $100 billion in the stimulus, maybe a tenth of it or more, 15%, that had to do with highway building, the shovel-ready projects. But what you needed was a project of infrastructure that would change the life of the average person in a positive way, make them see progress, avoid a terrible commute, right? Don't get an ulcer, don't get sick, don't have hypertension. Take the train downtown, take it back, clean, fast, safe, and reasonable price, too. That's another one. So look at all that. We don't need private interests sticking their hand in the public till by the idea that if they put up essentially a small investment now, they're going to get eternal rights to take this money out of that pot. Now, in this regard, right, the Democratic Party has not been valiant on this, right? Hillary had a $500 billion plan for infrastructure. It was not detailed. She could have put forward some of these exciting things, right? Things that would represent a real modernization and make people's lives easier. One of the effects of infrastructure, it's a very direct effect. It's always been measured. If you build infrastructure, you will increase the productivity of labor. And what is the productivity of labor? Well, it's everything. The productivity of labor is the rate of efficiency of your entire economy. And if people can get to work, if they can get clean water, if they can travel around, you save man hours, person hours, and you allow a much better result. So infrastructure improves the productivity of labor, and that is one of the absolute key variables in any economic analysis. And the Democratic Party has to open their eyes to this. The reputation of the New Deal is enormous. This is New Deal America. People are still yearning for Franklin D. Roosevelt and that colossal list of projects, right? Astounding, unbelievable, as we saw people saying it, right? Works Progress Administration, Public Works Administration. How about the Hoover Dam? How about the Golden Gate Bridge? All of these things. How about the New York tunnels? This all has something to do with this atmosphere promoted by Roosevelt. So I hope that will be the positive thrust. Now, of course, you got to watch out, right? A lot of people want to skim. A lot of people want to increase the bezel, let's say. So this is no good. And we'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., and it's our Thanksgiving program. Hey, let's remind ourselves what it is we're celebrating. Actually, before that, though, let's just say a few words again about reality and fakery, right? Because I came up with a list of 10 factors, which I have recited, which actually I intend to post when I get around to writing this down. Right? 10 reasons why the Democrats lost. The top reason is Comey. It's not a white lash. It's a Comey lash. I just got finished watching the France 24 News of the Week in Review, and they talk about the American election, and they don't talk about Comey, and they don't talk about the New York FBI field office with that idiotic rumor that there was going to be the indictment of Mrs. Clinton. They don't talk about that. They also don't talk about the voting rights law as applied, right? Scalia's poisonous heritage used to disenfranchise blacks, poor, old, Latinos, anybody not likely to vote Republican. And then, of course, the $3 billion paid to, not paid, but the $3 billion as an in-kind contribution to the Republican ticket, and how that was absolutely decisive during the primaries and then also later. And that was airtime, unrefuted, uncriticized, unbalanced, not fair, and not balanced. So we could also go into Gary Johnson and Jill Stein. Oh my God, Jill Stein was fated in Moscow. And I think this, again, shows a fundamental miscalculation about what the U.S. is all about. But we'll have to work on that over time. So all of that, I got to add another one now, because I have other ones. I have all the mistakes Obama made, all the mistakes Hillary made in terms of message, all the mistakes Hillary made in terms of her organization. She neglected Wisconsin. She neglected Michigan. She didn't have enough paid activists on the ground. She relied on volunteers because she had lots of them, but those are not good enough. So ultimately there was neglect. There was arrogance, and there was a fundamental lack of realization. Let me say this, because I've done this before, and I sincerely believe it. If you're going to run for office, the only way to run is to run scared. You've got to assume the worst in every situation, prepare for the best, but expect the worst. Expect that everything is going to go wrong for you. So you got to have redundant systems, not to do it once, but to do it twice or even three times, to make sure that what you want ultimately occurs. So we could go on, right? The difficulty of winning a third term in a row. Anyway, I have 10 points. Got to make it 11 now, because I've begun to understand this question of fake news. Here in the Washington Post of yesterday, we have an article. Caitlin Dewey writes, Facebook fake news writer says, I think Donald Trump is in the White House because of me. The Amish vote, okay? Here we have, if you look up Google, the Amish vote for Donald Trump. The Amish in America commit their vote to Donald Trump, guarantee him a presidential victory. Except it's not true. This is a pure invention. And the guy who apparently presides over this stuff, or under his aegis, it's done. Paul Horner, 38-year-old impresario of a Facebook fake news empire, says the Washington Post, has made his living off viral news sources for several years. He has twice convinced the internet that he's British graffiti artist Banksy, and he published the very viral news of a lawsuit by Yelp against South Park last year. And this is an aspect of this thing, the hue and cry against Zuckerberg of Google and the other people on Facebook. I'm sorry, the other way around, right? The Google executives and Zuckerberg to take action against deceptive outlets. In other words, that hoaxes are being widely spread. So here they have an interview. Again, he says, I think Trump is in the White House because of me. His followers don't fact check anything. They'll post everything, believe anything. His campaign manager posted my story about a protester getting paid $3,500 as a fact. Like I made that up. I posted a fake ad on Craigslist and then cited my own ad. And he does this stuff by, for money. He wants lucre. That's the idea. So, what are you going to do, Horner? we have to be aware once again of the tendency towards gaslighting. Now, this stuff, what we're dealing with here, this goes somehow beyond the level of usual hoaxes because it's systematic, it's continuous, and it's politically clever in the sense that you have to gauge things to see what will appeal to the people that you're trying to get to reiterate, regurgitate your stuff. We here represent the reality-based community. Going back to the Bush administration, you remember one of those neocons citing Nietzsche and actually citing Schopenhauer also, right? The world as will and imagination. Well, yeah, will and imagination, okay, but there's also the world of reality and facts and the fact-based community. The neocon in the Bush era said, ha, you guys are so slow, you're the reality-based community, you're hopelessly passé, we are the neocons, we rush ahead to create new realities with our deeds. Well, they ran out of steam before too long, but the gaslighting and the fakery go on, and therefore we of the reality-based community have to respond to this. Is there a malaise of the world? Well, I think there is a malaise of the world. I'm not Jimmy Carter, but there is a malaise, and it's got to do with radical subjectivity, which this is, right? In other words, if it appeals to me, I'm going to click on it and send it out, right? If I like it. That's radical subjectivity. What has to happen at some point in the process is that's got to be tested, it's got to be verified, it's got to be compared, checked, compared to facts and reality as you can get them from other sources. People are brutalized under globalization, under late imperialism, if you want. People are brutalized, but you're not going to get anywhere unless you provide some kind of reality-based solution. And that's why we talk about program. We've been talking about infrastructure today. We'll talk about other aspects. There is, of course, a heritage now from the media cover-ups of the JFK assassination, of Iran-Contra, of the 9/11 events, of the global war on terrorism, of the whole Al-Qaeda story, on and on. One of the reasons that people are so cynical about the news media and don't believe in facts anymore is the arrogant and systematic refusal of the so-called mainstream media to allow them in and to express themselves and actually to debate these things, right? Case in point, right? The Kane-Hamilton Commission on 9/11 did not entertain dissenting viewpoints, right? There was no day or hearing set aside, really, to people who didn't believe what they were putting out. So, the other part of it, of course, is that if the institutions can't provide a rising standard of living and everybody's unemployed or underemployed, that will discredit the institutions even more. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., concluding our Thanksgiving broadcast, and right now it's the Friday before, so Thanksgiving a little bit less than a week away. What is this holiday? We've done this before. Let's do it again. Obviously, there's the question of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Governor Winthrop and many things going back there. Some of these are legendary, some are authentic. The one I'd always like to stress is the one that I've sort of discovered myself. If we want to see the proclamation of a federal Thanksgiving holiday, it is done by President Lincoln, October 3rd, 1863, by the President of the United States of America, a proclamation. And here we see the year that is drawing to a close has been filled with the blessings of fruitful fields and healthful skies. We are in the midst of a civil war of unequaled magnitude and severity, which has sometimes seemed to foreign states, Britain and France, to invite and to provoke their aggression. Despite that, peace has been preserved with all nations. You're not at war with anybody except the Confederate States of America, which is not a nation. Order has been maintained, the laws have been respected and obeyed, and harmony has prevailed everywhere except in the theater of military conflict, while that theater has been greatly contracted by the advancing armies and navies of the Union. And remember, this is William Seward, Secretary of State, writing this, and that's an important point. Needful diversions of wealth and strength from the fields of peaceful industry to national defense have not arrested, have not stopped the plow, the shuttle, the textiles, or the ship. The axe has enlarged the borders of our settlements and mines, as well as iron and coal have increased the precious metals, and all of this has yielded even more abundantly than in the past. Population has steadily increased, notwithstanding the casualties in the camp, the siege, and the battlefield. And we have augmented strength and vigor. We are permitted to expect continuance of years with large increase of freedom. No human counsel hath devised, nor hath any mortal man worked these things. It's a gift of God. So, Te Deum laudamus, right? We praise God. The glory is not for us. So, again, finding the key part. I do therefore invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States, and those who are at sea, and those who are sojourning in foreign lands. I'm thinking of all the turkeys I cooked in Europe in the 70s and 80s, to set apart and observe that last Thursday of November next as the day of thanksgiving and praise to our beneficent Father who dwelleth in the heavens. And, you should put aside, you should have penitence for national perverseness and disobedience, and commend us all to the tender care of God. So, by President Lincoln and William Seward, Secretary of State. Now, this was written by Seward, and I want to point you to this thing that one of the first things he tells you is that it looked like during the Civil War there was a danger that other countries would have, they were practically invited and provoked to carry out aggression against the United States and intervene in the war, which did not fortunately happen. Now, remember, this is in many ways described as a thanksgiving for the winning of the Battle of Gettysburg and the taking of Vicksburg. Those would be things that have contracted the theaters of war. However, we have to realize that there was also a catastrophic event in early September, which was the Battle of Chickamauga, where the Confederate Army defeated the Union Army of the Cumberland and drove them all the way back into Chattanooga. And if it hadn't been for George H. Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, then that whole army could have been routed and Chattanooga retaken, and the question of British and French intervention would have been on the table once again. But that did not happen, and then within 2 weeks, say, of the Battle of Chickamauga, the arrival of the Russian fleet, the arrival of the Russian Baltic, European, Atlantic fleet in New York, and the arrival of the Russian Pacific fleet into San Francisco. And that's what they're referring to. The Thanksgiving is, this is all, it's unthinkable without the mood of practically euphoria, which gripped especially New York, Washington, the East Coast, and San Francisco as a result of the arrival of these Russian ships, because they meant that if Britain and France were to attack the United States, they would immediately be at war with Russia. That would mean a considerable navy, probably arrayed, not as a battle fleet, but as commerce raiders like the Alabama, Shenandoah, and so forth, very effective against British shipping and trade, and huge armies that could go into different parts of Europe and attack various places that were allied with the British there. So this was a very big thing. When I gave this lecture a while ago at the National Press Club, I had to say, guys, before you get a rope, after I say that there's a Russian component in Thanksgiving, listen to these facts, and I hope you can. You've heard them too. So the U.S.-Russian relation is absolutely critical. It will be here for a long, long time after the incoming administration is long gone. And I think I am horrified by the Russophobia that I see in the mass media, in the Democratic Party. I'm horrified by the Islamophobia that I see. But in this case, what we need to do is to proceed as fast as we can to neutralizing the Syrian civil war. This is also what the regard we owe to Europe. Europe is being inundated by refugees. The refugees really don't want to be there. They don't want to take that perilous trip. They feel that their lives are in danger and they're forced to. And the Europeans would be happy to welcome smaller numbers. But the sheer volume, the mass, the overwhelming numbers of people coming in is too much for them. And that is unchaining scoundrel time. That's what's going on in the Europeans, right? The people who are trying to essentially play on these issues of backlash and resentment and xenophobia against these foreign forces. So that, I think, is an important thing to bear in mind. So you may find I've been trying to develop arguments for the Thanksgiving table, and my arguments for the Thanksgiving table are a whole bunch of things. We've been doing them for a couple of days now on the American system. We'll do them on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Go and subscribe to the American system. We've still got to do whatever happened to Karl Marx, whatever happened to the working class. I have a lot of first-person stuff on that. The London Economist has a headline, a cover story. It's called The New Nationalism. And it's the spirit of 76, right? The old painting, right? With the three guys, the fife and drum and the flag and all that. So it's Trump in the middle, Putin on one side, Farage on the other, and Marine Le Pen in the left corner.